The champagne glass slipped from her fingers the moment she saw me walk through those ballroom doors. I watched it fall in slow motion. Crystal shattering against marble. Golden liquid spreading like split truth across the floor. Her face drained of color, lips parting in a soundless gasp. Behind her, my twin brother froze mid-laugh, his arms still draped around her waist possessively, territorially, like he'd earned that right. But he hadn't. I had been the one she fell in love with. I had been the one who held her through thunderstorms, who learned the way she took her coffee at 3 in the morning, who memorized every constellation of freckles on her shoulder. I had been the one who promised forever under that cherry blossom tree, who slipped a ring onto her finger with trembling hands, who whispered vows into her hair the night before I left for London. And my brother? He simply showed up at the wedding in my place. He wore my suit. He spoke my vows. He kissed my bride while I was lying in a hospital bed an ocean away, fighting for my life after the accident that was supposed to kill me. The accident he knew about. The accident he never told her about. For 3 years, she lived a lie. For 3 years, she loved a ghost wearing my face. And tonight, on their so-called anniversary, I came back to haunt them both. Her voice cracked when she finally whispered my name. Not his. Mine. And that's when I knew everything was about to burn. I met her on an October afternoon that smelled like rain and old books. The cafe was tucked between 2 buildings most people walked past without noticing, the kind of place that survived on regulars and stubbornness rather than foot traffic. I'd been going there for months, always ordering the same thing. Black coffee with 1 sugar. Always sitting in the corner where the afternoon light hit just right for reading, where the noise of the street faded into something manageable, something that felt less like loneliness and more like solitude. She appeared like punctuation in the middle of a sentence I thought I already understood. Her hair was caught in the door when she walked in. Long and dark and tangled in the brass handle like the universe was trying to keep her out. She laughed at herself, a sound that was embarrassed and genuine and entirely unguarded. She tugged it free with one hand while balancing a leather portfolio under her other arm, the kind architects carried, stuffed with dreams rendered in graphite and ink. When she looked up, our eyes met, and something in my chest rearranged itself. Not violently. Not like the movies. Just a quiet shift, like furniture being moved in a room I'd thought was already perfectly organized. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, pointing to the chair across from me with a smile that apologized for the intrusion before I could even respond. Every other table was empty. The cafe was nearly deserted, the way it always was on Thursday afternoons. She could have sat anywhere. She chose my table. "It is now," I said. Her smile changed. Became something warmer, more knowing. Like she'd just confirmed a suspicion about me that I didn't know I'd given away. Her name was Elena. She told me this while settling into the chair, her portfolio leaning against the table leg, her coat draped over the back of her seat like she'd decided to stay a while. She was an architectural designer who sketched buildings the way poets wrote verses, all flowing lines and hidden meanings. She spoke about structures like they were living things, breathing and evolving and holding stories in their bones. I told her I was a structural engineer. That I turned dreams into mathematics, that I made impossible things stand. That I spent my days calculating load-bearing capacities and stress points, making sure beautiful ideas didn't collapse under their own weight. "We're opposite sides of the same blueprint," she said, her eyes bright with the realization. She was right. We were. We talked until the barista started stacking chairs on tables, giving us looks that were equal parts annoyed and amused. She told me about the library she wanted to design someday, all glass and light, where stories could float between floors. She described it with her hands, sketching invisible architecture in the air between us, her fingers tracing staircases that spiraled like DNA, reading rooms that hung suspended like tree houses. I could see it. The way she described it made me see it. Not just the structure, but the feeling of it. The weight of all those stories held in glass and steel and dreams. I told her about the bridge project in London I'd been offered, the opportunity that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. It was the kind of project engineers spent their whole careers hoping for. Ambitious. Impossible. The kind of thing that could make or break a reputation. "When do you leave?" she asked, and something fragile crept into her voice. Something that sounded like disappointment she was trying to hide. 6 months, I said. But I haven't accepted yet. She smiled then, soft and sad, like she already knew how this would end. You should. Dreams don't wait for people. But I was already wondering if some dreams were worth staying for. We exchanged numbers before we left. She wrote hers on a napkin in handwriting that slanted to the right, all those letters leaning into the future like they were in a hurry to get there. I saved it in my phone immediately, like I was afraid the ink might smudge, like I was afraid she might disappear if I didn't anchor her somehow. I walked home through streets that smelled like wet pavement and autumn leaves, my hands in my pockets, my mind replaying every word she'd said. The way she'd laughed when her hair got caught. The way she'd looked at me when I told her about the bridge, like she understood the weight of choosing between what you want and what you're meant to do. I didn't know it then, but that afternoon was the last time my life would feel simple. The last time I'd sit in that cafe corner without the ghost of her sitting across from me. The last time I'd think about the future without her face appearing in it, uninvited and inevitable. I texted her that night. Just 3 words. Same time tomorrow? Her response came in seconds. I'll be there. And she was. She showed up the next day and the day after that and the day after that until it stopped being a coincidence and started being a routine. Until the barista stopped asking what we wanted and just brought it to us. Until that corner table became ours in a way that didn't need to be spoken out loud. We talked about everything. Her childhood in a house full of blueprints and unfinished sketches because her father had been an architect too. My childhood in a house full of competition because having a twin meant everything was always compared, always measured, always split down the middle. She asked me what it was like, sharing a face with someone. Complicated, I said. Like looking in a mirror that has its own thoughts. She studied my face then, like she was memorizing it. Like she was trying to see past the surface to whatever made me different from my identical reflection. I think I'd know you, she said quietly. Even if there were 100 of you. I think I'd know which one was real. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But I didn't tell her about Damien. Not really. Not the whole truth about what it meant to share everything with someone who only knew how to take. I didn't tell her that my brother had spent our entire lives wearing my achievements like borrowed clothes, that he'd learned to mimic my mannerisms so well even our mother couldn't tell us apart on the phone. I didn't tell her because I didn't think it mattered. That was my first mistake. We fell in love the way buildings rise. Slowly, deliberately, one floor at a time. She started appearing at my job sites, bringing coffee in paper cups that burned our fingers and curiosity that couldn't be contained. She'd show up in a hard hat that was too big for her, drowning her in yellow plastic, and she'd stand there watching concrete being poured like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. I'd find her sketching in the margins of her notebook, turning steel beams into poetry, finding beauty in foundation work that most people found boring. She'd draw the skeletal frames of buildings before they had skin, before they had purpose, seeing something in the raw structure that I'd stopped noticing years ago. She saw the world differently, and being near her made me see it differently too. Look at this, she'd say, pointing to the way light moved through unfinished walls. It's like the building is breathing. And I'd look, and somehow it would be true. In return, I met her at gallery openings where she'd explain paintings to me in whispers, her hand warm in mine, her voice low and reverent like we were in a church instead of a repurposed warehouse in the art district. She'd trace the brushstrokes in the air between us, teaching me to read emotion in color and composition, showing me how pain looked different in blue than it did in red. I showed her how buildings spoke if you knew how to listen. The groan of old wood remembering what it used to be. The hum of glass reflecting sky. The way stone held temperature long after the sun went down, keeping warmth like a secret. We became fluent in each other's languages. 3 months in, she started keeping a toothbrush at my apartment. It appeared one morning in the cup next to mine, bright purple against my boring blue, and neither of us mentioned it. We just let it exist there, this small domestic claim that said she was staying. For months in, I started keeping a key to her studio in my wallet. She'd handed it to me on a Tuesday, casual as anything, like it wasn't a declaration. In case you need somewhere to think, she'd said. But what she meant was, in case you need to come home. My twin brother Damien met her at a dinner I should have cancelled. He came to the city unexpectedly, the way he always did, appearing in my life like weather. No warning. Just suddenly there, taking up space, expecting me to rearrange everything to accommodate him. He showed up at my apartment on a Friday night with that careless grin he always wore, the one that made people forgive him for things they shouldn't. I've got dinner plans, I told him, already dreading what I knew was coming. Great. I'm starving, he said, inviting himself along before I could form the words to uninvite him. We looked identical down to the scar above our left eyebrow, a childhood relic from a fall we both took but only one of us remembered. Same height. Same build. Same face that our mother used to kiss goodnight without knowing which son she was tucking in. But we weren't the same. We'd never been the same. So this is the girl who's making you reconsider London, he said when I introduced them, shaking Elena's hand a beat too long. His fingers lingered on hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a way that could have been accidental but wasn't. She laughed, pulling away, tucking her hair behind her ear in that nervous gesture she did when she was uncomfortable. He hasn't mentioned me. He mentioned someone, Damien said, his eyes finding mine across the table, holding my gaze with something that looked like amusement but felt like challenge. But he didn't mention she was extraordinary. There was something in his tone that made my spine straighten. A hunger I recognized because we shared the same blood, the same face, but not the same heart. I'd always been the one who built things. Damien had always been the one who took them. He spent the entire dinner doing what he'd always done. Charming. Entertaining. Telling stories that were half mine and half fabricated, blurring the lines between his life and mine until even I wasn't sure which memories belonged to whom. He made Elena laugh with an anecdote about our childhood that I barely remembered happening. You're so different from how Ethan described you, Elena said to him, smiling. Am I? Damien asked, but he was looking at me when he said it. We should go, I told Elena, my hand finding the small of her back, feeling the need to reclaim something he was trying to take. We have that thing tomorrow morning. We didn't have anything tomorrow morning. She knew it. I knew it. But she let me guide her out anyway, sensing the tension I couldn't quite name. On the sidewalk outside the restaurant, she turned to me, her face serious in the glow of streetlights. He looks exactly like you, she said. Yeah. But he doesn't feel like you. I kissed her then, relief flooding through me like a drug. She could tell us apart. She knew the difference. But the damage was already done. He'd seen her. He'd smiled at her. He'd felt the shape of her hand in his and memorized it. And Damien never forgot a smile. He never forgot anything worth taking. I should have known. I should have seen it. The way his eyes followed her when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he asked about her too casually the next day, texting me questions that felt like reconnaissance disguised as brotherly interest. How long have you been together? Is it serious? Does she know about the London offer? I answered because he was my brother. Because we'd shared a womb and a childhood and a face. Because I didn't know yet that blood doesn't mean loyalty. That dinner was in November. By February, I'd be in a hospital bed, and Damien would be standing where I should have been, wearing my suit, speaking my vows, kissing my bride. But I didn't know that yet. That night, I walked Elena home through streets that smelled like early winter, her hand in mine, my heart full of a future I thought was guaranteed. I love you, she said when we reached her door. I love you too, I said back. And I meant it. God, I meant it. I just didn't know how much those words would cost me. I proposed to her under the cherry blossom tree in Miller's Park, the one she'd once told me reminded her of every romantic movie she'd ever cried through. It was late April, and the tree was at its peak, drowning in pink blooms that seemed too delicate to be real. The petals were falling like pink snow, catching in her hair, on her shoulders, gathering at our feet in soft drifts that rustled when we walked through them. The air smelled sweet and green, like spring had finally decided to commit after weeks of false starts. I'd planned a speech. Something about how she'd redesigned my entire life, how loving her felt like finally understanding what I was built for. I'd written it down, revised it, memorized it until the words felt natural in my mouth. But when I dropped to one knee, when I saw her face change from confusion to understanding to something that looked like joy crashing into disbelief, the words scattered like those petals, and all I could say was her name. Elena. Just that. Just her name, like it was the only word I'd ever learned. She was crying before I even opened the ring box. Her hands came up to cover her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and she was nodding before I could even ask the question. Yes. God, yes. The ring was custom made. I'd spent 2 months working with a jeweler, sketching and revising until it was perfect. A sapphire the color of her favorite sketching pen, that specific shade of blue she used for shadows and water and sadness. It was set in a band I designed myself, all geometric lines that looked abstract until you tilted it just right and saw they formed a heart when you looked close enough. She wore it like it was made of light. We had 2 perfect weeks of being engaged. 14 days of telling everyone we knew, of her flashing that ring in the sunlight just to watch it catch and throw color. 14 days of planning a future that felt solid and real and inevitable. We looked at venues. We talked about honeymoons. We argued about whether to have the ceremony indoors or outdoors, laughing through disagreements that didn't matter because we were just happy to be building something together. Then London called. The hospital phoned on a Tuesday morning while we were still in bed, the sheets tangled around us, her head on my chest, my fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. I almost didn't answer. I should have let it go to voicemail. The bridge project had been accelerated. Political pressure. Funding that would disappear if they didn't break ground by summer. They needed me immediately. They needed me yesterday. I had 48 hours to decide my entire future. I hung up and just stared at the ceiling, feeling Elena's breathing against my ribs, feeling the weight of everything I was about to lose. Go, Elena said, even though her voice cracked around the word, even though I felt her fingers tighten on my chest like she was trying to hold me there through will alone. Come with me, I countered, already knowing what she'd say but needing to hear her say it anyway. I have the library bid presentation in 3 months. It's everything I've worked for. She pressed her forehead to mine, her breath warm against my lips. We'll make it work. It's only a year. 10 months, I corrected, like 2 months would make any difference. I'll come back for the wedding. We'll get married next spring. Next spring, she echoed, like a promise, like a prayer, like something that couldn't possibly break. We spent those 2 days trying to fit a lifetime into hours. We barely slept. We made love like we were memorizing each other's bodies, like we needed to store up enough touch to last through the separation. We talked about everything and nothing, filling the silence with words because soon there would be too much silence and not enough words. At the airport, she cried into my shirt, leaving mascara stains I didn't want to wash out. This is temporary, I told her, tilting her face up to mine. 10 months. Then we're never apart again. Promise? Promise. I should have taken her with me. I should have known that distance doesn't just measure miles. It measures all the space where lies can grow. All the room where someone else can step in and pretend to be you. All the silence where doubt creeps in and trust starts to crack. But I didn't know that yet. I kissed her one more time, tasting salt and goodbye, and then I walked through security without looking back because I knew if I looked back I wouldn't be able to leave. On the plane, I texted her. 11 words that I thought were romantic but were actually just naive. Already missing you. Can't wait to marry you next spring. She responded with a heart emoji and the words, come back to me. I did. Eventually. But by the time I came back, I'd been erased. And someone else was already living in the space where I used to exist. The car hit me on a Wednesday night in February, 3 months after I'd left. I was crossing the street near the construction site, my phone pressed to my ear, Elena's voice telling me about the library design she'd just submitted. She was excited, talking fast the way she did when she was nervous and hopeful at the same time. The words tumbled over each other, painting pictures of glass atriums and spiral staircases and reading nooks that looked out over the city. I remember laughing at something she said. Some joke about the client wanting the impossible and her giving it to them anyway. I remember the pride in her voice, the way she was already planning what we'd do when she won the bid, how we'd celebrate. I remember the screech of tires. I remember turning my head and seeing headlights, bright and close and moving too fast. I remember nothing after that except the taste of copper flooding my mouth and the sound of my own heartbeat slowing down, getting quieter, like someone was turning down the volume on my life. Then nothing. Just black. Just silence. Just gone. I woke up 6 days later to white walls and the steady beep of machines keeping me tethered to life. Everything hurt. That was the first thing I noticed. Not pain in one place but everywhere, like my body had been taken apart and reassembled wrong. I tried to move and couldn't. Tried to speak and managed only a groan that sounded like it came from someone else. A nurse appeared above me, her face swimming into focus slowly. You're awake. Thank God. You're in hospital. You've been in an accident. Don't try to move. Fractured skull. Broken ribs. Shattered collarbone. Internal bleeding they barely stopped in time. They listed my injuries like items on a shopping list, clinical and detached, while I lay there trying to understand how I was still alive. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I'd been erased and poorly redrawn, like someone had tried to recreate me from memory and gotten the details wrong. Your family's been notified, the nurse told me gently, adjusting the in my arm. Elena. I tried to say her name but it came out garbled, broken. Where's Elena? I tried to call her. My phone was destroyed in the accident, shattered in 2 pieces they'd found scattered across the pavement. I asked them to contact her, gave them every number I could remember. But the head trauma had scrambled my memory, mixed up digits, turned her lifeline into wrong numbers and disconnected tones. Every number I gave them came back as not in service or this number has been disconnected. Frustration turned into panic. I couldn't remember. The numbers were right there in my head but jumbled, like someone had taken them apart and put them back together in the wrong order. I tried again and again, each failure making me more desperate, more confused. We reached your brother, they assured me, like that was supposed to be enough. He's flying in tomorrow. Relief washed through me. Damien would know how to find her. Damien would tell her what happened. Damien would fix this. He arrived with flowers and a face arranged into concern. White lilies that smelled like funerals. He sat beside my hospital bed, holding my hand, saying all the right words. His face was my face, reflected back at me, and for a moment I felt disoriented, like I was looking at myself from the outside. Jesus, Ethan. You scared me half to death. When they called and said you'd been hit, I thought that was it. I thought I'd lost you. Elena, I managed to say. My voice was thick, slurred from the head injury. Need to tell Elena. I know. I know. He squeezed my hand, his eyes wet with tears that looked real. I'll take care of it. I promise. I'll make sure she knows what happened. Tell her I'm okay. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. I will. I'll tell her everything. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something gentle and terrible. Don't worry about the wedding. I'll make sure she understands. I'll keep her updated. You just focus on healing. I trusted him. We shared blood, shared a face, shared a childhood of whispered secrets and twin promises. We'd protected each other when we were kids, covered for each other, been each other when it mattered. I trusted him the way you trust gravity, the way you trust the ground to be there when you fall. That was my first mistake. Believing in him was my second. Because Damien never called her. He didn't tell her I was in a hospital fighting for my life. He didn't tell her I was asking for her every day. He didn't tell her anything true at all. Instead, he became me. He took my phone, my passwords, my life. He stepped into the space I'd left behind and pretended it had always been his. And I lay in that hospital bed, broken and trusting, while my brother stole everything I loved. I found out about the wedding 3 months after it happened. By then, I'd been transferred to a long-term recovery facility in Scotland, far from London, isolated in my healing while my body learned to function again. The head injury had stolen chunks of my memory, left me with gaps where Elena's phone number should have lived, where our plans should have been clear. Time moved strangely in that place. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, marked only by physical therapy sessions and medication schedules and the slow agonizing process of becoming human again. But I remembered her. God, I remembered her. Every morning I woke up reaching for a phone that didn't work, trying to call a number my brain had locked away behind walls of damaged tissue. The staff kept promising they'd help me reconnect, but bureaucracy and brain damage move at different speeds. Forms needed to be filled. Procedures needed to be followed. Nothing happened quickly in the world of rehabilitation except the erosion of hope. A former colleague visited me in May. James. We'd worked on the bridge project together before the accident. He brought whiskey in a flask and awkward sympathy in his eyes. I'm sorry about everything, man, he said, settling into the chair beside my bed. The bridge project is on hold indefinitely after what happened to you. But I have to say, your brother really stepped up. Taking your place at the wedding like that, making sure Elena wasn't left alone. That's real love. The words didn't make sense. They were in English but arranged wrong, meaning something impossible. What wedding? I asked. His face changed. Color draining. Eyes widening. The expression of someone who just realized they'd said something unforgivable. Oh God. You don't know. He showed me his phone. Social media posts I couldn't access from my hospital prison. Photos that loaded slowly on the terrible Wi-Fi, each pixel appearing like a small death. Elena in white, radiant and weeping, her bouquet of white roses and cherry blossoms clutched in her hands. And beside her, wearing my face, standing where I should have been, was Damien. The caption read, "Finally married my best friend. Some things are worth waiting for." There were more photos. Dozens of them. Elena laughing. Damien kissing her. Their hands intertwined, the sapphire ring I designed glinting on her finger. Comments underneath from people I knew, people we both knew, congratulating them, saying how beautiful they looked, how perfect they were together. My brother had shown up at our wedding. My colleague explained it in halting sentences, piecing together the story from what he'd heard through the grapevine. Damien had told Elena I'd gotten cold feet. That I'd called him crying, begging him to tell her I couldn't go through with it. That I'd realized London was more important than marriage, that I'd changed my mind, that I was sorry but I just couldn't do it. He said I was a coward. He said all of this while wearing a suit identical to the one hanging in my London apartment, while standing in a church we'd chosen together, while looking at a woman who thought he was me. And then, while Elena's heart was breaking, while she was vulnerable and shattered and surrounded by guests who'd traveled to see her marry the man she loved, Damien offered to stand in. Just for the ceremony, he'd told her. So the day isn't completely wasted. So you have photos to remember what could have been. So you're not humiliated in front of everyone. Except he never stepped aside. He kept standing there, in my place, living my life, loving my wife. He moved into my apartment. He answered to my name. He let her believe the lie because it was easier than telling the truth. And she never knew the difference. I couldn't breathe. The hospital room was spinning, tilting, turning inside out. I heard a sound like an animal dying and realized it was coming from me. How could she not know? I managed to ask. How could she not tell us apart? But I already knew the answer. We were identical. Down to the scar, the mannerisms, the way we laughed. I'd spent my whole life being mistaken for him. Teachers, friends, even our own mother sometimes got us confused. And Damien had studied me. He knew how I moved, how I spoke, what I liked and hated. He'd been preparing for this his whole life, learning to be me better than I was. Elena fell in love with a ghost wearing my face. And the real me was erased, forgotten, turned into a villain in a story I'd never agreed to be part of. 3 years. She'd been married to him for 3 years while I fought to recover, while I tried to get back to her, while I believed she was waiting for me. The whiskey James brought burned going down but I drank it anyway, hoping it would burn away the images in my head. Elena in white. Damien's hands on her waist. The life I was supposed to have, stolen and repackaged and sold as truth. I'm going to fix this, I told James. He looked at me with pity. How? She thinks you abandoned her. She thinks Damien is you. What are you going to do, show up and tell her she's been living a lie for 3 years? Yes, I said. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Because happiness built on lies is just a house with no foundation. And I was coming back to knock it down. I spent 1 full year trying to get back to her. 365 days of waking up in hospital rooms that smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. 365 nights of staring at ceilings that blurred because my vision hadn't fully returned. Every morning began with physical therapy, my legs remembering how to carry weight they'd forgotten existed. The limp was stubborn, clinging to my right side like a ghost that refused to leave. My therapist said it would fade with time. Time. That word had become my enemy. Speech therapy came next. The brain injury had left its mark not just on my body but on my voice. Words slurred at the edges, consonants softening into something unrecognizable. I practiced my own name in the mirror until it sounded like me again. Ethan. 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 Sometimes I wondered if I was trying to convince the reflection or myself. Then came the psychiatric evaluations. Room after sterile room. Doctor after skeptical doctor. Each one looking at me like I was crafting an elaborate delusion, a fantasy born from trauma and medication. I told them the truth and watched disbelief settle into their clinical expressions. My brother stole my identity. My brother married my fiancée. My brother erased my entire existence and wore it like a costume. It sounded insane even to my own ears. But insanity doesn't come with time-stamped medical records. Insanity doesn't have hospital bracelets with your name printed in block letters. Insanity doesn't have witnesses who saw you broken and comatose while someone else said vows that belonged to you. I built my case piece by piece. Not for a courtroom, though lawyers would come later. I built it for something more important than justice. I built it for truth. For proof that I existed, that I mattered, that I hadn't simply vanished into the convenient narrative Damien had constructed. The hardest part wasn't the physical recovery or the mental gymnastics of proving my own existence. The hardest part was understanding how completely, how methodically, he had isolated her from me. I found out through hospital records and phone company archives. Damien had changed my number within days of the accident. He told Elena I'd blocked her out of shame, that I couldn't face her after abandoning our wedding. He intercepted letters I'd managed to write in those early confused months when my hands barely remembered how to hold a pen. Those letters, filled with apologies and explanations and desperate love, were returned to hospital staff marked refused and unopened. But the handwriting on those refusals wasn't mine. It was his. Damien had studied my penmanship our entire lives, the way twins do, learning each other's patterns until imitation became effortless. He'd forged cruel messages in my writing. Told her I regretted everything. Told her I'd chosen my career over her and never wanted to look back. Told her to move on, to forget, to let me go. And when she was drowning in that manufactured abandonment, when she was at her lowest and most vulnerable, he was there. Constant and kind. Familiar and safe. He wore my face like a mask, used mannerisms he'd observed and absorbed since we shared a womb. He told her stories about our childhood, about moments we'd lived together, but he positioned himself as the protagonist. My memories became his currency. She fell in love with him because she thought he was me. That realization was the knife that twisted deepest, the wound that no amount of physical therapy could heal. She hadn't betrayed me. She'd been faithful to the end. She'd just been faithful to the wrong version of my face. I tracked their life through the digital breadcrumbs people leave scattered across social media. Anniversary posts marking milestones that should have been mine. Photographs of them at the restaurant where I'd planned to take her for our first anniversary. Pictures of them standing beneath cherry blossom trees in Japan, the trip we'd marked on our shared calendar, the dream we'd whispered about in the dark. She wore the sapphire ring in every photo. The one I designed with a jeweler over 3 months, choosing the exact shade of blue that matched her eyes in certain light. She wore it on her left hand, believing the man beside her was the one who'd promised forever under falling petals. They looked happy. God, they looked so genuinely, beautifully happy. That was worse than anger, worse than seeing her miserable. If she'd been unhappy, I could have told myself she knew something was wrong, that her heart recognized the deception even if her mind couldn't name it. But she glowed in those pictures. She smiled with her whole face. She looked like she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for. My life thief had stolen more than my identity. He'd stolen my happiness and learned how to wear it convincingly. But I knew something Damien had never bothered to learn. I knew that happiness built on lies is just a house with no foundation. It looks solid from the outside, beautiful even, but it's standing on nothing. And houses built on nothing don't just crack. They collapse. They bury everyone inside. I spent that entire year getting stronger. Relearning my body. Reclaiming my voice. Gathering my evidence. And with every step I took without limping, with every word I spoke without slurring, with every document I added to my growing file of proof, I was building something too. Not a house of lies. A wrecking ball of truth. I was coming back. Back to reclaim what was mine. Back to destroy what he'd built in my absence. Back to show Elena that the man she'd married was nothing but smoke and mirrors and stolen stories. Damien had 3 years to play pretend. 3 years to get comfortable in my life. 3 years to believe he'd actually gotten away with it. But his time was running out. And mine was just beginning again. The rain started the night I bought my plane ticket home. I stood at the hospital window, watching water streak down glass, and thought about foundations. About truth. About how long lies can survive before the weight of reality crushes them. Not much longer. Not much longer at all. I chose their 3rd anniversary deliberately. Carefully. With the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. Not out of cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't anger thrumming beneath my ribs like a second heartbeat. I chose it out of strategy. 3 years was long enough for comfort to rot into complacency. Long enough for Damien to stop checking over his shoulder. Long enough for the lie to feel like truth, for the performance to become his identity. Long enough for the truth to hit like a building collapse instead of a tremor. 3 years meant the fall would be catastrophic. And I needed it to be. I bought a ticket to the gala he'd organized under my name. The invitation had been easy to acquire. A fake identity, a generous donation, a few strings pulled through connections that still remembered the real me. The venue made my chest tight when I saw the address. The Grand Meridian Hotel. The same place where we'd planned to have our reception, back when the wedding was supposed to be mine, back when forever meant something. He'd even kept the same color scheme. Sapphire and silver. Elena's favorites that I'd suggested during our planning sessions, favorites that had somehow become his borrowed taste. Every detail was a theft. Every choice was plagiarism. I wore a suit identical to his. I'd seen enough photos to know his style, and his style was my style because Damien had never developed his own. Same cut, same color, same designer label. When we were kids, maybe 7 or 8 years old, we used to dress alike deliberately. We'd confuse our teachers, swap classes, fool our parents at dinner. Back then it was a game. Tonight it was a weapon. Tonight I wanted him to look at me and see his reflection staring back. I wanted him to remember that everything he was wearing, everything he was pretending to be, was stolen property. The ballroom was massive and glittering. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across hundreds of people who didn't know they were celebrating a crime. I waited in the doorway, half hidden by shadows and arriving guests, watching the scene like a director observing his production. Elena stood near the center of the room, surrounded by people whose names I didn't know. She wore a dress that moved like water, deep blue silk that caught light and held it. Her hair was longer than I remembered, falling past her shoulders in waves that made my fingers ache with phantom memory. But it still caught light the same way. Still moved like dark honey when she turned her head. She looked older. Not in a bad way. In the way people grow when life shapes them. More settled into herself. More confident. The girl I'd loved had become the woman I'd always known she would be. I just hadn't been there to witness the transformation. Someone said something that made her laugh. The sound carried across the ballroom and hit me like a physical thing. I'd forgotten that laugh. Spent 3 years trying to remember it exactly and failing. But hearing it now, it was like my body remembered even though my mind couldn't quite capture it. She looked happy. Genuinely, beautifully happy. The sapphire ring glinted on her finger as she gestured, catching light like a tiny trapped star. Then I shifted forward, just one step, into the fuller light of the ballroom. Damien saw me first. He was standing near the bar, accepting congratulations from a couple I didn't recognize. His glass was halfway to his lips when his eyes found mine. The color drained from his face so completely, so suddenly, I thought he might actually collapse. The glass trembled in his hand. Champagne sloshed against crystal. Our eyes met across the room, across 3 years of lies and theft and erasure. In his expression I saw everything. Guilt that he'd probably forgotten he could feel. Fear, raw and animal. Defiance too, that stubborn twin arrogance that had always defined him. And underneath it all, the sick understanding that the ghost he thought he'd successfully buried was standing in his doorway, wearing his face, ready to haunt him. His lips moved. Maybe my name. Maybe a curse. I couldn't hear from this distance, but I could read the devastation in the shape of his mouth. Elena noticed his reaction. Followed his frozen stare. Turned slowly, like she was afraid of what she might find. And then she saw me. The champagne glass fell from her fingers before she could stop it. It shattered on the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and liquid that seemed impossibly loud. The sound cut through conversation, through music, through the carefully constructed illusion of the evening. People turned. Stared. Someone gasped. But I only saw her. The way her face went pale. The way her hand lifted to her throat like she couldn't breathe. The way recognition and impossibility crashed together in her expression, creating something I didn't have a name for. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't have sound yet. Then, finally, in a voice that was barely a whisper but somehow reached me across the entire ballroom, she spoke. Not his name. Mine. The real one. The one that belonged to me. And in that single word, the entire illusion began to crack. The carefully constructed house of lies started its collapse. 3 years of deception shattered as completely as the champagne glass at her feet. I took another step forward. Then another. People parted without realizing they were moving. The crowd opened like a wound, creating a path between us. Damien moved too, stepping between us like he could still protect the lie, like his body could be a barrier against truth. But it was too late. Far too late. The ending had already begun. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elena's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke my name. Not Damien's. Mine. The real one. The one I'd been teaching myself to answer to again in hospital rooms and therapy sessions. Ethan. The way she said it broke something fundamental in the room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Laughter died. The string quartet faltered, the music becoming discordant before trailing into silence. Every head turned toward the three of us, forming a triangle of impossible tension in the middle of the glittering ballroom. Two identical men. One devastated woman. A truth that was about to detonate. "Hello, Elena," I said quietly. My voice was steady despite my heart trying to punch through my ribs. I'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, but nothing prepared me for the reality of it. For seeing her up close. For watching recognition and impossibility war across her beautiful face. Damien moved first, his body a wall between us. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly. Too quickly. The desperation in his voice made my stomach turn. "Isn't it?" I kept my eyes on Elena, refusing to acknowledge him as anything but the obstacle he'd always been. "Tell me, Elena. Do you remember the scar above my left eyebrow? The one from when we were 8 years old and fell out of the treehouse in my backyard?" I watched her carefully. Watched the way memory flickered behind her eyes. Her hand lifted unconsciously, automatically, to Damien's face. Her fingers traced the familiar mark just above his left eye. The scar she'd kissed 1,000 times. The scar she'd run her thumb across in the dark, in bed, thinking it connected her to me. "We both have it," Damien said quickly, his voice tight with panic barely controlled. "We're twins. Identical twins. Of course we have the same scar." "True," I agreed, my tone conversational despite the violence I felt coiling in my chest. "But do you remember the story, Elena? The one I told you about how I got it?" I watched understanding begin to dawn. Watched her eyes move between us, comparing, calculating, trying to find the crack in reality that would make this make sense. "You said," she began slowly, her voice shaking, "you said you were trying to save a bird's nest. That you climbed too high and the branch broke. You fell and hit your head on the garden fence." "That's my story," I said softly. "My memory. My scar. My stupid 8-year-old logic that thought I could save baby birds." I looked at Damien, letting every ounce of my rage show. "Did he tell you the same one?" The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed against my ears like water at depth. Like drowning. Damien's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump. His hand reached for Elena's wrist, fingers wrapping around her like he could physically keep her from understanding. But she pulled away like his touch burned. Like his skin had suddenly become poison. "What's your story, Damien?" she asked. Her voice was small but sharp. A knife wrapped in silk. He couldn't answer. His mouth opened but nothing came out. Because he'd never bothered to create his own history. He'd been too busy stealing mine, wearing it like a costume, never thinking he'd be asked to prove it was real. I pulled the medical records from my inside jacket pocket. Thick manila envelope, heavy with truth. Time-stamped documents. Verified signatures. Undeniable proof that on the 15th of June, 3 years ago, while Elena walked down an aisle in white, I was in a hospital bed with machines breathing for me, with monitors tracking brain activity that barely registered human. "I never left you," I said, holding her gaze. Willing her to hear me. To really hear me. "I never stopped loving you. I never changed my mind. I never walked away. I was just gone. Erased." And he stepped into the space where I used to be and pretended it belonged to him. I held out the envelope. She took it with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second. I watched the color drain from her face as understanding replaced confusion. As reality rewrote 3 years of her life. "He told me you blocked my number," she whispered. "That you couldn't face me. That you'd chosen your career and wanted me to move on." I never said any of those things. I paused, letting the truth settle. Because I couldn't. I was in a coma. Elena's legs gave out. Someone behind her moved quickly, catching her before she hit the floor. But she wasn't looking at her rescuer. She was staring at Damien like she'd never seen him before. Like the man she'd woken up next to for 3 years had suddenly become a stranger. The room erupted. Voices rising in confusion and shock. People pressing closer, phones appearing, recording the collapse of a marriage built on fraud. Security moved toward us but stopped, uncertain what crime they were witnessing. But all I could see was her face. The way understanding and devastation crashed over her features like waves destroying a sand castle. The way her eyes filled with tears that had nowhere to go but down. The way her hand moved to her ring finger, touching the sapphire like it had transformed into something toxic. She'd married a stranger wearing a familiar face. She'd given 3 years of her life, her love, her body, her trust, to a man who'd stolen someone else's identity. Every kiss had been a lie. Every promise had been plagiarism. Every moment of happiness had been built on erasure. I wanted to reach for her. To pull her close and tell her it wasn't her fault. That she'd been faithful to the end, just to the wrong version of my face. But I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Could only stand there and watch the woman I loved realize she'd been living inside a lie so complete it had consumed 3 years of her existence. Damien finally moved, taking a step back. Then another. His face was blank now, shut down, the way it used to get when we were kids, and he knew he'd been caught doing something unforgivable. "I'm sorry," he said. To her, to me, to the room. To no one. And then he turned and walked away. Walked through the crowd that parted like he carried disease. Walked out of the ballroom, out of the hotel, out of the life he'd stolen. He didn't run. Didn't make a scene. Just disappeared like smoke. Like he'd never been real to begin with. Maybe he hadn't been. Elena collapsed fully then, her body folding as sobs took over. Someone called for a doctor. Someone else called security. The gala dissolved into chaos and whispered speculation. But I just stood there, medical records scattered at my feet, watching the woman I loved break apart. And knowing that even though I'd won, even though the truth was finally free, we'd both lost something we could never get back. 3 years. 3 stolen years. And no amount of truth could give them back. The annulment took 6 months to finalize. Half a year of lawyers and paperwork and legal language that tried to make sense of something senseless. Fraud. Identity theft. Coercion. Emotional manipulation. The terms were clinical, sterile, antiseptic as hospital floors. They had nothing to do with the devastation they described. Nothing to do with the way Elena's life had been hollowed out and filled with lies. Damien didn't fight it. He signed every document without argument, without appearing in court, without trying to defend the indefensible. He disappeared the night of the gala and I haven't seen him since. Maybe guilt finally caught up to him. Maybe shame became heavier than arrogance. Maybe he just moved on to the next thing he could steal, the next life he could inhabit. I didn't care anymore. I'd spent enough years focused on him. I was done letting him occupy space in my head. I was too busy trying to help Elena pick up the pieces of a life that had been built on sand. She didn't want to see me at first. For weeks after the gala, her phone went to voicemail every time I called. Her apartment door stayed closed when I knocked. I understood. More than understood. I wore the same face as her nightmare. Every time she looked at me, she saw 3 years of deception staring back. She saw the lie-wearing skin. She saw the man who'd climbed into bed with her under false pretenses, who'd touched her with stolen hands, who'd whispered love in a borrowed voice. I gave her space. Sent letters I didn't expect her to answer. Left voicemails that I knew went straight to deletion. Waited with the patience of someone who'd already lost 3 years and knew that healing doesn't follow timelines. But slowly, painfully, like bones knitting back together after a terrible break, we found our way back to conversation. She called on a Tuesday. I almost didn't answer because the number was unknown. But something made me pick up. Some instinct that I knew. "Can we meet?" Her voice was small. Tired. Nothing like the confident woman I remembered. Nothing like the happy wife in those anniversary photos. She sounded like someone who'd survived something terrible and wasn't sure who she was anymore. "Anywhere," I said. "Anytime." We met at the same cafe where it all began. Back when we were college students with more dreams than money, when the future felt infinite and uncomplicated. We sat at the same corner table, beneath the same abstract painting that had witnessed our first conversation. We ordered the same coffee. Dark roast for her, Americano for me. Everything familiar except us. We'd both been changed by the theft. Shaped by absence. scarred by betrayal in ways that didn't show on skin. She looked thinner. Older. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around her cup, like she needed something to anchor her to the moment. "I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted quietly. "Any of this. You. My own judgment. My own heart." She looked up at me, and the pain in her eyes was unbearable. "I loved him thinking he was you. I gave him everything thinking I was giving it to you. How do I separate those feelings? How do I know what was real?" "I know," I said, because I didn't have better words. Because there were no better words. "I don't know if I can either." "Then why are we here?" I looked at her. Really looked. Saw all the ways she'd grown and broken and rebuilt herself in my absence. Saw the woman she'd become when I wasn't there to witness it. Saw the strength it took to sit across from me now, to face the human reminder of everything she'd lost. "Because 3 years ago, I promised you forever," I said. "And I don't break my promises, even when they're stolen. Even when someone else tries to fulfill them in my place. Even when everything goes wrong. I promised you forever, Elena. And I'm still here." She started crying then. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet tears that fell like rain on old wounds, like grief finally finding permission to exist. "I loved him thinking he was you. Every touch. Every kiss. Every time I said I love you, I was saying it to you. But it wasn't you. How do I live with that? How do I forgive myself for not knowing?" "You don't," I said honestly. "Because false comfort would be another lie, and we'd had enough lies for 3 lifetimes. You don't forgive yourself today. Maybe not tomorrow either. Maybe not for years. But maybe eventually you understand that you were faithful. You loved me the entire time. You just didn't know I was missing." She shook her head. "I should have known. Should have felt something wrong. He spent our entire lives learning to be me." I reached across the table slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. My fingers brushed hers, the first intentional touch in 3 years. He studied every mannerism. Every expression. Every story. He was a perfect copy. "You didn't fail, Elena. You were deceived by someone who made a deception in his life's work." Her hand turned under mine, palm meeting palm. The sapphire ring was gone. Her finger was bare, slightly paler where the band had lived for 3 years. She looked vulnerable without it. Raw. Like she'd shed armor and didn't know how to be safe anymore. "Tell me your stories," she whispered. "The real ones. Every scar. Every memory. Every truth he stole and wore like they belonged to him. I want to know you again. The actual you. Not the version he performed. Not the man I thought I married. You. The real Ethan." So I did. I told her everything. I told her about the treehouse and the bird's nest and the fence that caught me wrong. About the time I broke my wrist skateboarding and lied to our parents about how it happened. About the teacher in 7th grade who told me I'd never amount to anything and how that pushed me to prove her wrong. About my first gallery showing and how I threw up from nerves in the bathroom before it started. I told her about the accident. About waking up confused with tubes in my throat and machines breathing for me. About the months of therapy. About the psychiatric evaluations where doctors looked at me like I was delusional. About tracking their life through photographs and feeling like I was watching someone else live in my skin. She listened. Didn't interrupt. Just held my hand across the table and let me fill in all the spaces Damien had left blank. When I finished, the cafe was nearly empty. Hours had passed. Our coffee had gone cold. But something between us had shifted. Not healed. Not fixed. But shifted. Like a bone reset after being broken wrong. "I don't know if I can love you again," she said quietly. "Not the way I did before. That person doesn't exist anymore. I'm different. You're different. We're both carrying trauma that didn't exist 3 years ago." "I know," I said. "But maybe we can start over." She looked up at me, and for the first time since the gala, I saw something other than devastation in her eyes. "Maybe we can build something new. Not the relationship we planned. Not the marriage we dreamed about. But something is true. Something that belongs to us and not to the lie." "New story," I said. "Same hearts." "Same hearts," she agreed. "Different people." We sat there as the cafe closed around us. The barista cleaning tables. The last customers are leaving. Rain starting to fall outside the window, drops racing down glass like tears finding the fastest way down. We didn't kiss. Didn't make promises. Didn't pretend that sitting in a cafe could undo 3 years of devastation. But we held hands. And we stayed. And slowly, carefully, like architects drafting blueprints over burned foundations, we began talking about what we could build from the ruins. It wasn't the love story we'd planned. Wasn't the fairy tale ending we'd dreamed about under cherry blossoms. It was messier. More complicated. Scarred by theft and lies and time we'd never get back. But it was ours. Finally, completely. Painfully ours. And maybe that was enough. Maybe enough was all we needed. Maybe love wasn't about perfection or grand gestures or promises that never break. Maybe love was just two people choosing to stay, even after everything fell apart. Choosing to rebuild, even when it would be easier to walk away. Choosing truth, even when lies had been more comfortable. We walked out of the cafe together as rain fell harder. Neither of us had an umbrella. We got soaked within seconds. But neither of us ran for cover. We just walked. Side by side. Into whatever came next. Together.